Tokyo, December 1941. The lights inside the Naval General Staff building burned through the night, glowing faintly against the blackout curtains drawn across every window. The smell of ink and cigarette smoke hung heavy in the stale air. Around a long oak table, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy studied a single sheet of paper, a document that would define the gamble of their empire. Typed neatly across its top margin were the words, "Estimated Naval Strength of the United States." The figures seemed simple, reassuring even. Japan's intelligence section, after months of reconnaissance and intercepted communications, believed the U.S. Navy could field roughly 296,000 active sailors. The Americans, they concluded, were powerful but scattered, their fleets divided between the Atlantic and the Pacific, their factories still recovering from depression. The officers around the table nodded in agreement. The number felt manageable, almost comforting. Admiral Nagano, the chief of the Naval General Staff, exhaled through his nose and said quietly, "If we strike now, before they awaken, we can dictate the terms of this war." Outside, the city slept beneath a winter sky. The attack on Pearl Harbor was only days away. Japan's leadership believed they had found a window, a 6-month advantage where their navy, built around aircraft carriers and fast battleships, could crush America's Pacific presence before the enemy's true strength could come to bear. Their entire plan rested on one assumption, that America's response would be limited, hesitant, and slow. In the offices of the combined fleet at Kure, engineers and officers stared at maps dotted with red pins: Pearl Harbor, Guam, Wake, the Philippines. Every target chosen to cripple the United States' ability to project naval power west of Hawaii. To them, it wasn't madness. It was mathematics. If Japan could eliminate America's forward bases and destroy its main battle line, Washington might sue for peace before 1943. At worst, Japan could fortify its new empire, a vast defensive ring across the Pacific, and force the U.S. into a war of exhaustion. The planners took comfort in Japan's victories in the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War, where limited, decisive campaigns had won them regional respect. They underestimated one thing: the United States was not Tsarist Russia, nor the exhausted European empires of 1918. They were awakening a nation of industry. The morning of December 8 in Tokyo, December 7 across the Pacific, brought the news that Admiral Nagumo's carrier force had succeeded beyond expectation. Pearl Harbor burned. Battleships lay overturned, oil slicks blazing across the harbor's surface. Japanese officers cheered as reports flooded in. It seemed proof their estimates had been correct. America, they believed, would lose its will to fight. Radio Tokyo called it the divine thunderbolt of the Emperor's Navy. But across the ocean, in Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt was already dictating his speech, the words that would change everything. "A date which will live in infamy," he said. In those lines, the sleeping industrial giant began to stir. In the weeks that followed, Japan swept across the Pacific with near-total dominance. Guam fell, the Philippines trembled, the British fleet in Singapore was crushed. By February 1942, Japan's control stretched over 1/10 of the Earth's surface. The officers in Tokyo's war rooms began to talk of victory timetables, of negotiation terms that might make Japan a permanent Pacific empire. The figure of 296,000 American sailors was still written on their charts, unchanged. They saw it as the ceiling of America's strength, and they believed they had already broken it. But in factories thousands of miles away, another kind of war was already beginning. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, and San Diego, sirens blew at dawn and men and women poured into steelworks, shipyards, and assembly plants. The United States government had declared total mobilization. Within weeks, car companies were building engines for bombers, refrigerator plants were forging aircraft parts, and textile mills were sewing Navy uniforms by the millions. In February 1942, the U.S. Navy reported over 400,000 active sailors, a jump of more than 100,000 in less than 2 months. Japan didn't know it yet, but their initial estimate was already obsolete. By the summer of 1942, the first Liberty ships began sliding off American slipways. Each one carried enough cargo to sustain entire island campaigns. New destroyers and submarines left shipyards faster than Japan could sink them. The Americans had unleashed something Japan's leaders had never fully grasped: an economy with no ceiling. For every ship Japan built, the United States built 10. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 50. The war Japan imagined, a limited campaign to secure resource zones, was rapidly mutating into an industrial storm. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States and understood its capacity, tried to warn Tokyo's leadership. "I fear," he once said, "that all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But even he had not foreseen the full scale of what that meant. In early 1943, while Japan still clung to its empire, American naval manpower crossed 1 million men. Shipyards in California ran night and day under floodlights, their cranes feeding the sea with new hulls faster than charts could be updated. By 1944, those 296,000 sailors Japan had first estimated had multiplied sevenfold. In the Pacific, the effects became visible. Japanese reconnaissance pilots flying over the Solomons and the Gilberts reported seeing vast new fleets appearing seemingly overnight, carrier groups that hadn't existed months before. "We have sighted at least 8 carriers," one pilot radioed before being shot down. In Tokyo, staff officers dismissed such reports as exaggeration. Their pride blinded them to the math. They still believed American manpower and resources must have limits. They didn't understand that America's limits were being rewritten every month. By late 1943, the first Essex-class carriers entered service, huge, fast, and deadly. They were symbols of an empire in motion. Each one carried thousands of sailors, aircraft, and machines built by invisible armies of civilians across the continental United States. Behind them trailed destroyers, cruisers, oilers, and transports, the veins and arteries of a logistical organism unlike anything Japan had ever faced. Meanwhile, in Japan, the air raid sirens began to wail more often. Industrial production slowed as American bombers reached deeper into the home islands. Shipyards at Yokosuka and Kure struggled to repair damaged ships. Skilled workers were drafted into the army. Where the United States was adding men by the hundreds of thousands, Japan was bleeding them away. The balance had shifted, though few dared admit it aloud. Official reports still spoke of equal determination and divine spirit, but beneath the surface, officers began to understand that spirit could not weld steel or fuel ships. In January 1944, Japan's Naval Intelligence Department finally received updated American manpower figures from Swiss intermediaries. The number stunned them: 2,034,343 personnel, active and reserve. More than 6 times their original estimate. One officer, upon reading the figure, whispered, "Then it is already over." They knew that even if every Japanese ship and aircraft fought perfectly, the outcome was now inevitable. The United States could afford to lose fleets and replace them. Japan could not replace even a squadron without breaking its own economy. Across the Pacific, American sailors joked about the assembly line navy. New ships arrived faster than they could memorize their names. The ocean that had once belonged to the rising sun was now filled with gray steel bearing white stars. From Pearl Harbor to the Marianas, the tide had turned. Japan's empire was shrinking beneath the sheer weight of numbers, the proof that the war had become a contest not of bravery, but of capacity. And yet, even as the statistics told their story, on the decks of those ships, individual men still believed they were fighting for survival, for brothers, for something more than numbers. That was the cruel paradox of the Pacific War, the heroism of thousands trapped within the arithmetic of millions. The night skies over Tokyo began to glow orange by 1945. The great shipyards lay in ruins, and the navy that once ruled Asia was now a ghost fleet, broken and scattered. The number that had once seemed comforting, 296,000, had become a symbol of arrogance, of the fatal blindness of leaders who mistook courage for capacity. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, over 2 million Americans had served in the U.S. Navy. The Pacific Ocean, once thought too vast to conquer, was now a highway of American steel. And in the quiet halls of Tokyo's War Ministry, the surviving officers looked again at those papers from 1941, their old estimates, their confident predictions, and realized what they had never truly understood. They had gone to war believing they could win with precision, with skill, with faith in the emperor's destiny. But war, they learned too late, is not only fought with ships and courage. It is fought with factories, fuel, and the will to outlast the impossible. That was the day Japan's admiral stopped asking how they lost, and began to understand why. The winter of 1943 came quietly to Japan, but inside the naval bases of Kure and Yokosuka, the silence was suffocating. Once busy docks that had echoed with the clang of steel now stood half empty. The hulks of damaged ships rested in dry dock, their sides scarred and their decks twisted from battle. Japan's empire still stretched across the map, from the Philippines to Burma, from the Marshalls to the Solomons, but it was an empire of ghosts. Supply lines were thinning. Fuel reserves were vanishing. And the officers who had once spoken of victory timetables now spoke only in whispers. In Tokyo, the War Cabinet continued to receive optimistic reports, carefully written, deliberately incomplete. The Ministry of the Navy still spoke of strategic withdrawals, never defeats. Yet inside the Combined Fleet's Underground Command Center at Toyohashi, Admiral Manaichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, knew the truth: Japan was fighting an enemy it could no longer measure. "We underestimated their will," he confessed one night to his staff. "We thought them soft, unwilling to bleed. But they bleed endlessly, and their blood is oil and iron." Across the ocean, the United States had become a nation of factories. The sound of machinery replaced the hum of normal life. In California, women in bandanas operated welding torches, joining the ribs of new destroyers. In Michigan, Ford's massive Willow Run plant rolled out bombers like cars on an assembly line. In Brooklyn, cranes groaned as hulls slipped into the water one after another. The U.S. Navy's enlistment offices could barely keep up, sailors lined up by the thousands, young, grinning, confident. They came from farms, from cities, from every corner of America, united by a single promise: to avenge Pearl Harbor and bring the war home. Every month, more ships filled the sea. In 1942, Japan still held numerical superiority in carriers and cruisers. By 1944, the ratio had inverted, disastrously. Where Japan could launch a dozen destroyers in a year, America launched hundreds. The Imperial Navy's admirals began to understand that even perfect victories could no longer change the outcome. A single carrier sunk meant months, sometimes years, to replace. The Americans replaced theirs before the smoke cleared. It was around this time that Japanese intelligence officers began compiling captured American propaganda leaflets, photographs, and industrial data. One photo, smuggled through neutral Switzerland, became infamous within the Naval Ministry. It showed the U.S. Navy's new training base at Great Lakes, Illinois, an ocean of white uniforms stretching as far as the eye could see. Rows upon rows of sailors standing in formation, thousands of them, barely out of school. On the back of the photograph, an officer scrawled a single note: "This cannot be counted." Meanwhile, American submarines prowled like sharks. They didn't just target warships, they hunted Japan's lifelines. Tankers, transports, freighters, all vanished beneath the waves. The seas around the Philippines turned into killing grounds. Japan's once vast merchant fleet, nearly 6 million tons before the war, was reduced by half within 2 years. Fuel shipments from Borneo and Sumatra dwindled. By late 1944, even the most powerful Japanese warships were being rationed for oil. Battleships sat idle in harbors because they could not afford to move. And yet, Japan continued to build, not because it believed it could win, but because it could not accept surrender. In the shipyards, workers labored under bombing raids, assembling fragments of hope: smaller carriers, suicide submarines, experimental weapons. The dream of a decisive battle, a single, glorious engagement to turn the tide, still haunted the Navy's leaders. They believed that if they could inflict enough pain, America might seek peace. But America's resolve had already hardened into something unbreakable. At Pearl Harbor, now reborn as a fortress of vengeance, fleets gathered for the island-hopping campaigns that would carry the war across the Pacific. Names like Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, each became a stepping stone toward Japan itself. With every battle, more ships appeared on the horizon, so many that even Japanese spotters stopped trying to count them. One officer wrote in his log, "The sea itself seems to have turned gray." By mid-1944, the United States Navy had grown into the largest naval force in human history. Over 1,200 major combat vessels. Tens of thousands of support ships. 2 million sailors and marines. Entire floating cities roamed the Pacific, task forces so vast that their wakes covered miles. They carried their own fuel, their own food, their own hospitals, their own repair docks. America had not just built ships. It had built an entire world upon the sea. When Admiral Somu Toyota took command of the combined fleet after Koga's death, he inherited not a navy, but a memory. The ships still floated, but their crews were thin, their training rushed, their equipment obsolete. Radar was scarce. Anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed. And yet, Toyota ordered one last grand plan, Operation Shogo, the decisive battle for the Philippines. The idea was to lure the U.S. fleet into a trap near Leyte Gulf and destroy it in one blow. It was a fantasy, but it was all Japan had left. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf began, the largest naval battle in history. On one side, the Imperial Japanese Navy, reduced but desperate. On the other, the U.S. Navy, a leviathan of iron and manpower. Over 200,000 American sailors faced fewer than 60,000 Japanese. The sea turned into a furnace of fire and steel. Kamikazes dived from the sky. Battleships traded shells over the horizon. But the outcome was never in doubt. When the smoke cleared, Japan's navy had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Its surviving ships limped home, out of fuel and out of hope. In Tokyo, the news hit like a physical blow. The Admiralty fell silent. The realization that had been forming for years now became undeniable. Japan had lost the sea. And with it, it had lost the war. In the aftermath, a small team of naval officers gathered to analyze the battle's outcome. Among them was Commander Watanabe, a quiet man who had once been part of the intelligence division that made the original estimate of America's strength back in 1941. He spread the new figures across the table. The room fell silent. Before them lay the updated American naval roster, over 2 million men, with more still in training. His voice trembled as he said, "We thought we were fighting an army. But we were fighting a continent." That night, as the city outside lay dark under blackout, Watanabe wrote in his diary, "Our greatest mistake was not strategic. It was spiritual. We believed we could measure a nation's soul in ships and sailors. We never understood that their strength came not from their numbers, but from their unity." In the Pacific, the consequences of that unity were visible everywhere. The U.S. Navy now had so many ships that they had to anchor them in double lines. Fleets moved with mechanical precision, resupplied at sea by endless convoys of tankers. Pilots slept in shifts. Engineers repaired planes mid-ocean. Battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, like the West Virginia and California, had returned, resurrected from the mud and flame. The symbolism was unmistakable. What Japan had destroyed, America had rebuilt, stronger. And in Japan's ports, the opposite was true. The once proud battleships Yamato and Nagato sat idle, their great guns silent. Fuel drums were guarded like treasure. Crews were ordered to drain fuel from training ships to keep combat vessels afloat. In some cases, destroyers were sent out on missions with barely enough oil to return. The empire's arteries were collapsing. The war had become a mirror, one side reflecting abundance, the other starvation. American sailors wrote letters home from mess halls overflowing with food, from ships with refrigeration, air conditioning, and medical care. Japanese sailors, meanwhile, wrote from the edge of exhaustion, their rice rations cut, their uniforms threadbare, their morale shattered. Still, in their hearts, they fought on. Not for victory anymore, but for honor, for memory, for the belief that dying well was better than surrendering poorly. That belief would fuel the final, desperate months to come. But in Tokyo, deep beneath the Imperial Palace, a few men had already accepted what the rest could not. They had seen the reports, the photographs, the impossible numbers. They knew that Japan's dream of ruling the Pacific had ended not at Pearl Harbor, but in the moment they underestimated the United States, when they wrote that fateful number on a piece of paper, 296,000. Now, that number was a ghost haunting every command room, every conversation, every sleepless night. The year was 1945. Tokyo was burning. Night after night, the sky turned red as waves of American bombers crossed the horizon. The firestorms were not battles, they were annihilations. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished in hours. Wooden homes became infernos. Streets melted. Millions were displaced. And still, the emperor's broadcasts called for perseverance, endure the unendurable. But in the naval bases that had once been the pride of Japan's empire, the end was already plain. Where once stood mighty fleets, there now remained only fragments, rusting hulls, skeletal cranes, ghostly docks. The Imperial Navy, the weapon that had carried Japan's dreams of conquest across the Pacific, was dead. The Yamato still waited in the inland sea, the largest battleship ever built, a floating monument to a vanished age. Its engines were silent, its crew restless. They knew there was no victory left to win. Yet orders came down. The ship was to sortie for Okinawa, to sacrifice itself in a final gesture of defiance. "You are to die gloriously," Admiral Ito told his men. "Japan expects it." On April 7, 1945, the Yamato sailed for the last time. Her decks gleamed, her guns were manned, her flag flew proudly. But she never reached Okinawa. The reckoning. When the Allied occupation began, American naval intelligence compiled the full record of the Pacific War. They compared the estimates Japan had made in 1941 with the reality of 1945. The numbers spoke louder than any speech could. Japanese estimate, 1941 296,000 U.S. Navy personnel. Actual U.S. Navy strength, 1945 2,034,343 personnel, nearly 7 times greater. Japan had not miscalculated by degrees, it had miscalculated the nature of its enemy. It had thought America's heart was soft, its spirit divided, its people unready. Instead, it had awakened something vast and terrible, a unity forged in rage, grief, and industrial might. A Japanese historian later wrote, "We fought a war of warriors against a nation of workers. And in the end, the workers built a world that warriors could not destroy." Across the Pacific, the American fleet filled the harbors of Japan. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, thousands of them. The very sight of them was overwhelming. To the Japanese who saw it, it was as though the ocean itself had turned into steel. They had once dreamed of ruling these waters. Now, they could barely comprehend them. For the U.S. sailors, victory was not joy but exhaustion. Many were barely 20 years old, their faces sunburned and hollow. They had crossed the world and survived storms, battles, and years of death. They did not cheer when the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri. They simply stood at attention, silent, watching history close its final chapter. Epilogue, the count beyond counting. In the quiet after the war, the same Commander Watanabe who had once predicted 296,000 sat in a small Tokyo office, staring at the figures again. 2,034,343. He traced the numbers with his finger, as though touching the ghost of his own mistake. Outside, the city was rebuilding. Children played in streets that had been ruins only months before. Ships were being cut apart, melted down, transformed into bridges and trains. The empire that had dreamed of conquest was now learning the art of peace. In his final journal entry, Watanabe wrote, "We counted their ships. We counted their men. But we never counted their will. And that was the number that defeated us." In the end, Japan did not lose because it was weak. It lost because it misjudged the strength of a nation united not by conquest, but by purpose. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose an armada that could not be measured in ships or sailors, but in the sheer will of a people who refused to surrender. When Japan estimated 296,000 U.S. sailors, it believed that was the limit of human power. But when they finally counted 2,034,343, they realized the truth. They had never stood a chance.